I tried my first beer when I was 12 years old, which seems crazy now that I look at 12-year-olds and how young they look, but somebody pushed a beer my way at a ditch party and I drank it and I felt different. You know, it seemed to fix the hole in me, at least temporarily. And I tried to do that as much as I could and to feel whole as much as I could with drinking.
About 6 years ago, we found out that we were pregnant, and that we found out that my daughter, Catherine had a congenital heart defect at 20 weeks of pregnancy. So it was a hard decision for us. We had the option of whether terminating the pregnancy or moving forward with the pregnancy. And so we met with the cardiology team at CHLA, and where they explained all the surgeries that my daughter would have to need after she was born, all the risks and complications associated with those surgeries. And of course, we decided to continue with the pregnancy.
A year ago, I was a broken young woman. I had come out of an abusive relationship. I was a single mother of 3 beautiful children. I carried a lot of hurts and anger and bitterness for where I was, still fighting to keep God in my home and trying to raise my children by myself. Seemed impossible with my heart being broken. I let nobody touch me. I wanted to be close to nobody. So I secluded myself from everything that I ever loved.
In high school, I started experimenting with other drugs. I tried my first pill, and it seemed like it needed more and double just to hit the same note that original beer took me. I wasn't a terrible student. I ended up going to college on a Navy scholarship, and the last year there, I was dating a girl, and she got pregnant, and I had to figure out what to do with this situation. And I joined the Navy, and I tried my best to live a normal life, but the alcohol always took over, and I always returned to that. But I got out with an honorable discharge, and I moved back into Orange County, and I just started some very dark drinking and using. And my son was 3.5. I'd hardly ever seen him at that point, and I just remember getting to the lowest point.
11 days after she was born, she had her first surgery. Post-surgery, doctors could tell that there was something going on internally that they couldn't figure out. 4 months after the first surgery, doctors recommended doing the second surgery earlier than what they hoped. It was just too painful for us to see her in pain. And just by looking at her, I can tell she was already exhausted from fighting. It was devastating. And of course, our daughter passed, I think it was like 6.5 months after birth.
I broke, I sobbed, I physically could not get my forehead off of the floor. And that moment is where I told God, my heart is hard, it is bitter, and only by the act of divine intervention will it ever change. You have it, I do not see how it will change, but I give it to you. And he took my heart that day and took that challenge, and he started mending me that day.
Something so powerful about a story, especially when you hear a story about other people's lives. That for many of us, when we hear the story, it does something deep inside of us. It evokes some kind of emotion. It kind of does something in our mind. There's something that stirs in our heart, because maybe for some of us, we actually can connect with that story. That you and I somehow, some way have been there before. We know what those feelings are like. That we too have maybe made some mistakes or have made some bad decisions that have led us to places that we never had intended of going. And so we know that well. Others of us, we maybe know personally the people that are in the stories, and there seems to be our heart kind of pouring out towards them for what they're dealing with and what they're experiencing at the moment. Some of you that are new to church, you might say, well, that's an interesting way to start off kind of an Easter talk, to kind of talk about something that's supposed to be celebrated. And yet there's others in the room that maybe for the first time, you're kind of taken aback that maybe there's a church that would go beyond just surface level things. That maybe there's a church that would be willing to be honest and authentic and transparent, to actually cut beneath the surface and talk about real stuff that's happening in the real lives of very real people. to not just come and just to celebrate, but to come and sit in the moment. See, I don't know what brought you here today. I don't know how you got here today. I don't even know who's gonna owe you lunch after today for coming, right? But here's what I do know about today. You have a story. All of us in this room, we have a story. The story of our lives. It makes up who we are, where we've been, what we've done, where we're going. It talks about who we're becoming. Each and every one of us have this story. And I know, I want to be the first to tell you today, you all look incredible, by the way. Incredible. But here's the deal. I know that sometimes our story hasn't always felt incredible. Here's what I believe. I believe that there are some of you that fought against the urge today to just stay in bed and to pull the covers over your head. And you got up enough courage and enough energy to pull yourself together on the outside. But there's some very real things that are unsettling on the inside. There's some very real things that just aren't seeming to click well, aren't seeming to go well. And you don't know what to do with that. And you don't know how to process that. All you know is that it's your story, just like it's Chad's story, just like it's the Via's story, just like it's Lisa's story. It's a story of our life, but maybe I want to suggest today that maybe the most important part of our story, the most important part of your story and my story is how our story ultimately connects and collides with God's story. The story of God and what God has done, the Easter story. Today is an incredible story. It's a life-changing story, but I'm going to be honest with you. Up front, I'm going to tell you, it's a resurrection story. And for some of you in the room, I get it. You're unsure about faith. Maybe you're skeptical about faith. Maybe you're not even sure about this whole Jesus thing. Is it real? Is it whatever? But before you go hashtagging fake news, could you just pause for a moment? Could you just sit in it for a moment and consider, could there be something real about this? Could there be something true about this? Because isn't it true of us that just because you deny something, just because you push against something, just because you totally overlook something, doesn't necessarily mean that that thing hasn't happened. That thing necessarily isn't true. That just because we push against those things, but I know how you and I are. We like facts. We like things of historical significance. Especially when it comes to our lives and something that has to do with our lives. Something so profound as things like freedom. We're fascinated with freedom. We desire freedom. Everybody in this room wants to be free. It's who we are as a nation. It's who we are in our world. We even signed documentation like in the 1700s, this Declaration of Independence that says a new day has come. We are going to be free. We're going to set ourselves apart. Or maybe it was the 1800s and Abraham Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation that says that there are going to be people who are unjustly enslaved. They will now be free. But yet we continue to fight for that freedom because we know that freedom doesn't come easy. Some of you may be old enough to remember the Montgomery bus boycott where Rosa Parks sat on her seat and she said, enough is enough. Anybody should be able to sit wherever they choose to sit on any given day, no matter who you are. The civil rights movement breaks forth and suddenly we are all chanting and fighting for our freedom. God honoring freedom, where God sees us all the same. People he's created in his image, desiring that freedom. You know what's fascinating about the Easter story? It's all about freedom. The Easter story actually addresses something that there is no credible explanation for. How in the world did you and I end up in this building today at this particular moment, not just surrounded by each other, a multi-ethnic, a multi-generational crowd of people all celebrating the same thing, but how do we join together with not just hundreds, not just thousands, but millions of people, not in just the United States, but around the world that are pausing today, right here, right now, to celebrate something that changed everything. How do you explain that? How do we understand that? And how do we know that to be true? One author says it this way. He says that one of the unique aspects about Christianity compared to other faith movements is that it actually traces its origin to one particular event in one moment on one day in history that changed everything. It was the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's interesting to me that these very first Christians in the very first century, their favorite story that they loved to tell was all about the death, the burial, and the ultimate resurrection of Jesus Christ. They loved it so much, they talked about it everywhere they went, with everything that they did. They couldn't not talk about it. It was such a part of the fabric of who they were. In fact, it was foundational to their faith. They thought without the resurrection, we have nothing to stand on. We have no foundation. Guys like Paul. Paul, if you're here and you're skeptical about faith, you would love Paul because Paul was skeptical about faith in Jesus too. In fact, Paul, he hated Christians. Paul used to persecute Christians until one day the resurrected Jesus had an encounter with Paul and he changed Paul's life. And Paul chose to follow Jesus. He gave himself for the cause of Christ. And he writes about this story. He says this in 1 Corinthians 15, "For what I've received, I pass on to you of first importance." This is the most important thing you have to understand about today, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, but that he was raised on the third day according to scripture. He says, don't just take my word for it. Engage the historical documentation of people who came before me, guys like Matthew, guys like Mark, guys like John, who wrote about the life and teachings of Jesus, who were there, key eyewitnesses that saw the resurrection for themselves, that experienced Jesus for themselves. I took you to a time, a place. There was a garden. There was a day that everything changed. John, a follower of Jesus, one of Jesus' closest guys, one of his disciples. Jesus and him were close. He documents Jesus' life, and he tells us this is how it went down on that incredible day. He says that early on Sunday morning, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and found that the stone had been rolled away from the entrance. She ran and she found Simon Peter and the other disciples, the one whom Jesus loved. She said, "They've taken the Lord's body out of the tomb, and we don't know where they've put him." And Peter and the other disciple started out for the tomb. They were both running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. Now, can we just pause for a second and say, if you don't read your Bible, you should, because that was funny right there. Here you have John trying to be all serious about, okay, here, let me document this for you so you know what happened on the resurrection. Oh, by the way, I'm really fast. John, writing about himself, not only says that he's the one that Jesus loved, but he says Peter is slow. He had a head start and I dusted him. And then he continues his story. He says that he stooped in and he looked and he saw linen wrappings lying there, but he didn't go in. Simon Peter, slow Peter, finally arrived and went inside, and he noticed the linen wrappings lying there as well, while the cloth that had covered Jesus' head was nicely folded and laying apart from the other wrappings. Then the disciple who had reached the tomb first also went in. He saw, and then here's what happened. He believed. He saw, and then he believed. See, what you have to understand about faith in Jesus doesn't say take your mind out of it. Faith in Jesus doesn't just say blindly believe whatever we tell you. No, faith in Jesus causes you to think. It causes you to reason. It causes you to take the evidence at hand of the historical documentation to say, does this actually mean something to my life? And just because I push against it doesn't mean that it's not significant. That it doesn't mean that it didn't actually happen. They believed in a resurrection. And I get it. The resurrection for some of us, it's crazy. We can't possibly think like, how in the world could somebody be raised from the dead? Because I don't know if you know this or not, dead people, they usually stay dead. And so how could this actually happen? Did you know that you might not be the only one that wrestles with trying to get your arm and your mind around this idea of a resurrection? That these first century followers, they would have never believed in a resurrection. In fact, there are no historical accounts that say people were standing outside of the tomb waiting for Jesus to come out and say, hey guys, I told you so. There was nobody that had welcome home banners made. There was nobody that was outside like ready to pop the corks, you know what I mean, for Jesus. Like nothing was going to happen that way because they all saw that Jesus had been crucified and they all thought that he would just stay dead. That even in the first century culture, this idea of a resurrection isn't anything that anybody would have just believed without any kind of evidence, any kind of tangibility, any kind of proof. And that's why I love the resurrection so much, because here's what I know about the resurrection. The resurrection was not a private event. The resurrection wasn't some backstage pass like VIP party. Here, buy your wristband. We'll take you far out into the desert and we'll have a party. That wasn't what it was about. It was a public event, a public display. Everybody knew where the tomb was. Everybody knew the garden in which he was laid. Everybody understood the Roman government was involved. They rolled a stone over the tomb. They sealed the tomb. They put a guard in front of the tomb. They were more concerned about Jesus raising to new life than his disciples were. nobody thought that a resurrection was possible, but yet the resurrection was their story. It was these first century believers' story. And why would they have any reason to make up their story? Think about your life. When you think about your life, you don't make up your story. You just talk about the things that actually happened to you, the things that you actually have experienced. It makes no sense to make stuff up because you will be found out sooner than later. Why would they make it up? You know what's so interesting, though, about this? Is that not only did they not make it up, but they understood something about the resurrection that you and I easily miss. That because Jesus was raised to new life, that wasn't just a one-time event. That because Jesus was raised to new life, that had a direct impact on their life. That their life was now going to be changed both then and forever because of what Jesus had done for them. But let me ask you a question. Have you ever stopped to consider the story behind the story? The story behind the story of the resurrection, meaning we all know the kind of some bits and pieces of the story of Jesus and the resurrection and the Easter story. But have you ever stopped to think about the stories of those who actually brought you the resurrection story? Those who were actually there, who actually observed it, who actually were the key eyewitnesses of the resurrection story. People like Mary Magdalene, Mary from Magdala. That suddenly she's there, that if you're gonna make up a story about somebody raising from the grave, the Messiah raising from the grave, you would never ever have a woman be the very first witness to see that the tomb is empty. Because in this first century Middle Eastern culture, women had no voice. They were not considered to be credible witnesses to anything. Nobody would have listened to Mary's testimony about what was going on. But there was something significant about Mary. Mary was known in her culture as probably being a wealthy woman, but also Mary was known as being kind of crazy. In fact, people thought that she had some severe kind of mental disabilities that just kind of made her do things that people didn't quite understand. But one day she has an encounter with Jesus, and Jesus, in his love for her, doesn't push her aside. She is no longer a social outcast. Instead, he restores her value, he provides worth, he gives her back her dignity, and he completely heals her mind. That's what Jesus does. Nobody cared for Mary, but Jesus, in his love, he cares for her. He comes alongside her and he changes her life. What about this John? John wasn't the social outcast that Mary Magdalene was, but John was a follower of Jesus. He wasn't just a disciple, he was in the inner circle of disciples. He was like one of Jesus's right-hand guys, John knew Jesus well, but then suddenly you have John kind of scratching his head, can't figure out what's going on. He had given up so much to follow this Jesus, but this is the same John that stood there alongside Mary, the mother of Jesus, as they watched the blood flow, as their tears fell, as Jesus took his last breath on the cross. And John must have thought, man, I love Jesus, but I'm not sure that Jesus has the power to change this. And maybe you and I have been in that point too, where we think like, man, we love Jesus. We really want to believe in Jesus, but does Jesus have the power to change this, to fix this wreck, to fix this mess that I've made? Can he actually do that? And this was the same John that sat in the room with other believers, the other disciples. And as they're sitting in fear of their life, fear for being executed for having association with Jesus, suddenly Jesus does the unthinkable. Jesus shows up in the middle of their fear. And as he shows up in the middle of their fear, he doesn't knock on the door. He doesn't call ahead and say, hey, guys, I'm coming over. No, he just shows up. Because that's how Jesus rolls. He just shows up in your situation and the unthinkable ways that Jesus does. And he stands in front of them and he says, it's me. I'm alive. You remember? Just like I told you I would? Do you remember those talks that we had? And they're like, no. We didn't understand it then, but this is mind-blowing now, right? Like the reality is he says, we're alive. They got excited. And they were so pumped up. They couldn't wait to tell everybody, but then there was a problem. One of their friends wasn't at the party. His name was Thomas. Thomas wasn't at the party, but all his boys ran and said, hey, you won't believe this. Jesus is alive. You won't believe this. Jesus showed up. And he says, hey, guys, I did exactly what I said I was going to do. And Thomas, much like you and I, said, no. I'm not going to believe any of that. You expect me to believe that Jesus actually was raised to new life? I mean, be real. Unless I could know for certain that I can touch him myself, unless I can have the physical evidence in my hands, there's no way I'm going to believe this crazy story of yours. Here's what I love about Jesus. Jesus isn't afraid of our doubt. Jesus isn't afraid of the way that we doubt things. In fact, I would suggest for those of you that have a little doubt going on in your life right now, you're never more closer to Jesus than you are right now. Because Jesus is willing to step into the middle of your doubt. Jesus shows up. He shows up to Thomas, and here's how he does it. He says, Thomas, see right here? See right here where they pierced my hand with those nails? I want you to touch it. I don't want you to just know about it. I want you to experience it. I want you to touch it. And then he says, don't stop there. See in my side. See where I took a sword for you? I want you to touch it. I want you to reach out. I want you to know for certain that I have done this for you. Thomas, in the middle of his doubt, recognizes Jesus as his Lord is alive. And there's Peter. Slow Peter. Peter, who is also known as being impulsive. Peter, who loves Jesus, but he has some reckless faith. This is the same Peter that got out of the boat and walked a few steps on water before sinking. It's the same Peter that cut off one of the guards' ears as they came to arrest Jesus. But it's crazy. This is the same Peter that when Jesus was finally arrested and Peter was asked, hey, do you know this Jesus? That suddenly Peter says, I don't know him. Not once, not twice, but 3 times Peter denies ever having anything to do with Jesus. You can imagine Peter's tears. You can imagine his remorse. You can imagine the guilt that he carried as he looked on from a distance and he saw his friend, his Messiah, give his last breath, dying on a cross, and then suddenly it hits him. Have I done something that is so bad that is now it's unforgivable? Have I done something that is so wrong that there's no way I can get redemption from this because Jesus is dead? Think about what that must have felt like. Think about what was going on in their heart when they looked upon the cross, when they watched as they laid his body in a tomb. They thought all of their hopes, all of their dreams, all of their goals, everything they ever wanted has now been crushed, has now been destroyed. I don't know about you, but I know that my life isn't perfect. And I don't know about you, but maybe some of you came in today feeling like you're dead to life. Maybe you came in today, some of you feeling kind of dead on the inside. You look great, like I said, on the outside, but maybe you just kind of feel dead because you've lost faith. You've lost some hope. You feel dead in the delays of life. You feel dead in the disappointments of your life. You feel dead in all the discouragements from the bad decisions that you've made, and you're not sure what to do about it. But I want to encourage you today that the Easter story is a reminder to us that you and we don't have to stay dead in our circumstances. We don't have to stay dead in our situations because the tomb is empty. We celebrate the fact that Jesus was raised to new life, that Jesus didn't stay down, that Jesus got up. Jesus said, I am the resurrection and I am the life. He didn't say I can resurrect. He says, no, I am the resurrection. And because I am, I have the power to restore and renew your life. It's who Jesus is. It's what Jesus does. It's what Jesus affords to us. He steps into our messy story. The story that we've tried so hard to fix ourselves, knowing that we can't fix it. And Jesus provides us a rescue. Peter, my dude. Peter, he goes back to his old ways of living because he thought his Messiah was dead. Jesus shows up on the beach as Peter is fishing, calls him by name. Peter recognizes that Jesus is alive. He comes to Jesus. He repents of ever having denied Jesus. Jesus restores him and looks at him in the eye and says, I have a plan for your life, Peter. I have a plan for your life. I want to not just restore you, but I want to give you purpose. And he says, you're going to be a leader in my church. Peter got fired up and being filled with the power of God, the same power that raised Jesus Christ from the dead, not years and years and years and years later, but just weeks after the empty tomb, while news was still hot that there is no body in that tomb, right? That the news was going around town. Peter stands in a crowded square and he steps up with his big boy voice. And he says, listen, Jesus of Nazareth. He was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did among you through him, as you yourselves know. In other words, he says, listen, guys, there's not many of you that would deny the existence of Jesus. You saw him with your own two eyes. You know who Jesus is. You know that he stood in front of you, that he did signs, wonders, and miracles that you could not explain. He says, but just because you couldn't explain it, that doesn't mean that God didn't know what he was doing. I think some of you need to hear that today. Just because you can't explain it does not mean that God doesn't know exactly what he was doing. Because even when we were stuck in our pain, we were stuck in the deadness of life, Peter goes on and says that this man, Jesus, was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan, by God's foreknowledge for you. You, with the help of wicked men, you put Jesus to death by nailing him on the cross. Peter said, let's just get it clear. You thought you were going to do away with this Jesus. You thought if we could eradicate Jesus from our culture, move Jesus out of our society, everybody would be better for it. But Peter says, here's something that you failed to understand, that without Jesus, we have nothing. That without Jesus, we're not just bad people. That without Jesus, we're not just people that are just okay, that could use a little bit of help. No, we're not just unchurched people. We're not just lost people. Peter says that without Jesus, guess what? We are the walking dead. And I don't know if you know this, being dead is a problem because dead people can't do anything to help themselves. But Jesus steps into our situation. But God, with his foreknowledge, understanding this in advance, he says this, but God raised Jesus from the dead, freeing him from the agony of death because it was impossible for death to keep its hold on him. Did you hear that today? It was impossible for death to keep its hold on Jesus. It was impossible because of his love for you and his love for me that he would stay dead, that he would stay stuck in that tomb. No, Jesus got up, and because he got up victorious over death and the grave, you and I can be victorious in this life. You and I can experience new life in and through Jesus Christ because it was impossible for death to hold Jesus down. It is impossible for death to hold you down. It is impossible. What am I saying? It's impossible for us to stay dead in our anxiety and in our depression and in our hopelessness and in our worry, in our fear, in our relational struggles, in our addictions, and all the mess and the hurt of the pain and the past that is going on in our life. You need to understand that dead things cannot stay dead when the resurrection steps into our story. That when Jesus steps into our story, there is new life available for you and I because of what he did for us. For what we celebrate today, Jesus says, I need you to know this is who I am. This is what I do. As Jesus stood up before he began his ministry, he needed people to understand the Messiah had come, and this is what I'm going to do. And he reads a passage of scripture from Isaiah 61. Listen to what Jesus says about himself. He says that the Spirit of the sovereign Lord is upon me. For the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to comfort the brokenhearted, to proclaim that the captives will be released and the prisoners will be freed. He has sent me to tell those who mourn that the time of the Lord's favor has come, and with it, the day of God's anger against their enemies. To all who mourn, he will give them, listen, he'll give them beauty for ashes, a joyous blessing instead of mourning, festive praise instead of despair. In their righteousness, they will be like great oaks that the Lord has planted for his own glory. Jesus said, I have come to die for you, to give my life for you, but I will not stay dead. Instead, I will rise again so I can give you beauty for your ashes, so that I can rise again so that you can be raised to new life and no longer stay stuck. It's the great exchange. He says, would you trade your sorrow, your pain, your fear, your hurt, your struggle for my peace, my strength, my joy, my ultimate freedom in Jesus Christ? Would you accept that today? Would you choose to receive that today is the question. You and I can live as resurrected people. because Jesus got up out of the grave. And that's such the beautiful good news of the Easter story. The Easter story proclaims that from our ashes, beauty will rise. But don't get it twisted. The good news of Easter, the great story of Easter is not just a story of how really bad people can become really good people. No, the power of Easter is that it's the power by which dead people can be raised to new life. That we experience new life in Christ so that we can stand together with people like Mary Magdalene and Peter and John and Thomas and Paul, that we can stand together with our brothers and sisters like the Vias, like Chad, like Lisa, and we can proclaim that Jesus is King of Kings and that he is Lord of Lords. And we hold on to the fact that therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come, the old is gone, and the new is here. You better celebrate your risen Savior today and give God praise.
In high school, I started experimenting with other drugs. I tried my first pill, and it seemed like it needed more and double just to hit the same note that original beer took me. I wasn't a terrible student. I ended up going to college on a Navy scholarship, and last year there, I was dating a girl, and she got pregnant, and I had to figure out what to do with this situation. And I joined the Navy, and I tried my best to live a normal life, but the alcohol always took over, and I always returned to that. But I got out with an honorable discharge, and I moved back into Orange County, and I just started some very dark drinking and using. And my son was 3.5. I'd hardly ever seen him at that point, and I just remember getting to like the lowest point.
11 days after she was born, she had her first surgery. Post-surgery, doctors could tell that there was something going on internally that they couldn't figure out. 4 months after the first surgery, doctors recommended doing the second surgery earlier than what they hoped. It was just too painful for us to see her in pain. And just by looking at her, I can tell she was already exhausted from fighting. It was devastating. And of course, our daughter passed I think it was like 6.5 months after birth.
I broke, I sobbed, I physically could not get my forehead off of the floor. And that moment is where I told God, my heart is hard, it is bitter, and only by the act of divine intervention will it ever change. You have it, I do not see how it will change, but I give it to you. And he took my heart that day and took that challenge, and he started mending me that day.
I was on the freeway, and I swear everything stopped, and there was a spirit in that car and just talked to me and asked me what I wanted to do with my life, and did I really want to die, or did I want to live?
I was mad at God. I didn't want to trust in him. I almost lost my faith. And we didn't want to have kids anymore after that. We decided, you know what, this is too painful. I don't want to take that chance again to have more kids, and this happens. I don't want to take that gamble.
And not long after that day, I did meet somebody, simply by chance, and his name is Brandon. And when I met him, we hardly said but 5 sentences to each other that day, but there was a shift in my heart.
Within 2 days, I was in a detox at the VA medical hospital in Long Beach. And shortly thereafter that, I was in a treatment program. And there wasn't a ton of Christian people in that house, but there was this one guy. And he was alive, he had this light in his eyes, and he carried the Spirit of Jesus with him. And he invited me to church one day. And I went with him one Sunday, and that Sunday the sermon was the prodigal son, and it just seemed like it was directed directly at my seat. Shortly after that, I got baptized. I accepted Christ publicly into my life, and things have been changing. I've been sober ever since. I still take part in recovery fellowships, and I try to help other recovering alcoholics any chance I get. And this year, I met a great girl. She got baptized, and we're this awesome Christian couple. And on February 9th, I proposed to her, and we're going to get married this year in August. I'm 13 years sober this year on March 2nd. My son is in my life. He's a wonderful kid. He's 17 years old now, and I talk to him all the time. And it's just, I never knew that this was possible, or could be part of my life. But you know, just the things that God and has brought into my life based on just a little bit of willingness and trying to just engage that spirit in the smallest ways has just been amazing.
So with a lot of like prayer and also like sharing with my family and friends, and even like with our community group, we talked about, you know, our fear, and they were able to just really help us with, you know, trusting in God that, you know, he would give us a healthy baby. And sure enough, we ended up having Nathaniel, our son, who's 3, and he's heart healthy. And then we wanted to continue to grow our family, and we just recently had Sophia, and we found out that she's heart healthy. And you know, I still had a lot of like fear and anxiety, but knowing that, you know, trusting in God and knowing that he was, you know, that he's going to protect my kids just brought a lot of peace to my heart, and knowing that I could continue to grow my family.
And I allowed myself to open up just a little bit to be friends with this person. And in that brokenness, in that broken heart, in that not trust in people, but trust in the God who made me and made my heart, I surrendered to that as well. Hit the fast forward button. We are now engaged to be married. My heart has grown so close with the Lord. So I kind of in a way feel that my life has been redeemed. All of my heartache from losing 3 children in my life, I have now been blessed with 3 more, which are his. I feel where God took all of my brokenness and all of my pain, everything that I thought would break me, he grew into something beautiful.